And now our last, yes, sure, our last speaker of this session, Maki, Kubota, yeah, and a bunch of millions of the people that I let you mention because from the University of Norway, University of Nebrija, and Max Planck Institute. And the title of the talk is Bidialectal Exposure Modulates Neural Signatures to Conflicting Grammatical Properties, Norway as a Natural Laboratory. The floor is yours, Maki.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. As mentioned, there are many members on this team, not just me, but also my colleagues at Tromsø, as well as University of Nebrija and Max Planck Institute. So this is a very big collaborative work. And first, I think there were some posters looking at bidialectalism, but I just wanted to be on the same page. So bidialectalism refers to a case where individuals, bialectals, are sufficiently exposed to two vernacular varieties that are largely described under a singular linguistic label. And as you can see already from the title, we will be looking at the Norwegian landscape. But obviously in all of your countries, I'm sure there's lots of different dialects that are spoken. But Norway is quite a unique context in terms of dialects, and I will be explaining that in the next slide. But first, I think hopefully all of you will agree that from a formal linguistic perspective or prescriptively, there is a general consensus that bidialectalism or bilectalism involve two distinct representations of grammar, even though they are mutually intelligible. And however, and I'm going to use a quote from Bjorn in the audience here, whether a speaker builds up different grammars for different varieties, be it sociolects, dialects, or languages, must be an empirical question, which can only be answered with the help of standard psycholinguistic studies and not by our intuitions about what constitutes a language. And I really like this quote, and this is what we're going to try to pursue in this study. Okay, so in today's talk, I'm going to try to convince you all that bilectalism is a subcase of bilingualism. And this might be like, duh, question for some people. For some people, it might be like skeptical about this claim. But while there is some neurocognitive research on bilectal speakers, the existing literature has mainly examined phonetic, phonological, and semantic processing, and there's not much involved at the grammatical or syntactic level. And very little, you can like count with your fingers, how many studies have looked into bidialectal's processing of grammatical information in distinct dialects to which they become increasingly exposed. And even less is known about how the brain processes linguistic information in bilectal contexts. So back to Norway. My Norwegian is embarrassingly atrocious, but I know that dialect use has a strong position in Norway. Most Norwegians are at least passively bilectal and speak a local regional dialect, while at the same time, the urban Eastern Norwegian variety dominates the public space. So where we are in Tromsø, everyone speaks the Tromsø dialect. But the really interesting thing about Norway is that even in TV, media, everyone speaks their regional dialect. There's no standard spoken dialect in Norway. This is very different from like my country in Japan, where everyone speaks on news or television, or everyone speaks the standard Tokyo dialect per se. So this is something that's very unique in the Norwegian landscape. And there, on top of that, in Norway, there are two written standard varieties. So there's two ways to write the language as well, not just spoken, but writing. And these are called bokmål and nynorsk. 80% of the population writes in bokmål, around 20% in nynorsk. And on top of that, people also write in their own dialect as well, when, especially younger people, when they text or email people, they use their regional dialects to write as well. So everyone kind of uses different writing system as well as different spoken dialects as well. And what we're looking at in this study is how people process the Northern Norwegian, or what we speak in Tromsø, the Northern Norwegian dialect in this current study. Okay, so then what are we going to look at in terms of this Northern Norwegian dialect? The first condition that we're going to look at is number agreement. Now, this is a critical comparison. We investigate a property that differs between Northern Norwegian and other parts of Norway, so all the other dialects in Norway. And this is the plural marking in predicative adjective. So please consider the following standard. So this is, I call it standard, but non-Northern Norwegian sentence. So you have something like, Kari, I'm not gonna say it in Norwegian because my Norwegian's bad, but Kari told me that houses, husene there, is a definite plural marking here. And then she liked were expensive, dyre here, has a plural markings here. So there's an agreement between the noun and the predicative adjective, but only in the plural condition. So in this example sentence, the predicative adjective agrees with the noun and number. Now this is grammatical in all other dialects except for in Northern Norway. This is ungrammatical if a Tromsø person heard this sentence. Okay, so in Tromsø or in Northern Norway, we have to say it this way. Kari told me that the houses she liked were expensive. So here, husan is how they say it in Northern Norwegian, and there's a definite plural marking here, but the adjective is singular or bare noun, bare adjective here. So it doesn't agree, so this is non-agreement, and this is the grammatical form in Northern Norwegian. So to summarize, the predicative adjective in the sentence above cannot agree in number with the noun, so the grammatical choice is to use the stem form of the adjective, an uninflected form of the adjective. Okay, so to sum up, this is the difference in number agreement between the other parts of Norway versus Northern Norwegian. As you can see here, everything is the same except for the plural predicative adjective where there's a plural marking here, but a non-plural marking here. And you can see, I'm gonna give you an audio file. This is one of the production tests that we did. And please listen to it because you will see the difference here. So I'm gonna play it for you. First, we're gonna start out with the non-Northern Norwegianers, okay? The standard or the Eastern Southern dialect.
Bilene var fine, bildene var store, bøkene var gode, husene var dyre, jentene var smarte, veggene var gule.
So you hear the E at the end, like gule, smarte. Okay, now the Northern Norwegians here.
Bilene var fin, bildene var stor, bøkene var gode, husene var dyr, jentene var smart, og veggene var gul.
Yeah, so you don't hear the plural marking at the end, right? So there's a clear difference between the two. All right, so now property 2, we're gonna look at gender marking. Now this is a contrast, this is a baseline condition. We expect no differences at all in the gender condition because gender agreement is the same across all dialects in Norway. Now here, the baseline, we tested a pair of conditions showing a contrast in the same grammatical context, the predicative adjectives. That is true in both dialects, the neuter to common gender violations. So consider a sentence here, like Liv taught me that the dog, here the hunden, here is both in Northern Norwegian and non-Northern Norwegian marked with a definite singular common gender. And then here we have she trained was kind, snilt. You have the singular and the neuter marking, which is a violation in both dialects. So since this is shared across both dialects, we hypothesize that implicit responses to these violations should be robust and in line with typical responses to agreement violations in other languages. So we should see a clear P600 effect here. And this should not correlate to any other things like whether you're a native speaker or the exposure that you have to the dialect. Okay, so here are our research questions. How do Norwegians living in Northern Norway, so mind you, these people were all tested in Tromsø where we live, process gender and number agreement information in the Northern Norwegian dialect mode? And to what extent do exposure and or native speaker status to the Northern Norwegian modulate potential individual differences? And what does answering 1 and 2 entail for discussions of whether bilectalism is a proper subcase of bilingualism? And in particular, how non-native dialectal acquisition mirrors or not the typical L2 bilingualism patterns. Okay, so on to the participants. Thank you. We had 111 Norwegian speakers, and they were native speakers of Norwegian, but they lived in Tromsø, and they come from different parts of Norway. So some were born and raised in Tromsø, a true Northern Norwegianer, or what you say, we call them native Northern Norwegianer, and 56 of them were in that, and the others were people who came from Oslo, other parts of Norway. And because of this, they have different types of experience exposure with Northern Norwegian. So we assess this by using an adapted version of the LSBQ, which is kind of a questionnaire that gives you a composite score of how much exposure you have to that language, but we adapted it to the Northern Norwegian dialect. Okay, so now the methods. We used a kind of a classic standard RSVP grammaticality judgment task. I have to stress to you that this was conducted in the Northern Norwegian dialect. So not in Bookmall, not in other languages, just in Northern Norwegian. And as I told you before, a lot of people write in Northern Norwegian, so it's not very weird to see a sentence written in Northern Norwegian. So this was the case. We presented the stimuli one by one, so you'll see something like a fixation cross. And then Mari told me that the cars she bought was cool to drive around, basically. And then they had to answer whether it was the sentence they saw was correct or incorrect, or correct or incorrect. Now, we have to stress again that what we instructed to the Norwegian participants was that if this is a sentence that you could potentially hear and could be okay with a Norwegian person saying that, then press correct. If not, if it's totally something you would never hear a Norwegian saying it, press incorrect. And this is going to be important when I interpret the behavior results. So this is the instruction that we gave them. Okay? And as I said before, there was number agreement trial, number non-agreement, gender agreement, and gender non-agreement trials. Okay, so now let's go to the behavior results first. As I said before, the instructions were that this is something potentially you can hear in Northern Norway, click OK, good, okay? So for gender, we see a very big difference. So you can see that the proportion of acceptance, how much they said that this sentence is okay. You can see that for agreement, everyone says great. For non-agreement, there are still acceptance, but much lower overall. This is the aggregated results. Now let's look at the number agreement. Remember, number agreement and non-agreement is flipped across dialects, right? We see totally same. They all accept it. They're all fine, whether it's an agreement or non-agreement trials, they're both okay with what they see. And that's a stark contrast to what we see in the gender condition behaviorally. Okay, so now let's look at the ERP results. This is the aggregate results for gender. Now remember, in gender, we should see a clear P600 effect. And this is exactly what we see. We see that around the 600 milliseconds, you start to see a difference between agreement and non-agreement trials. And the non-agreement trials, which is ungrammatical, elicits a higher amplitude. Okay, and this is distributed across the scalp, as you can see in the topograph here. And this is significant, obviously. Now let's look at the aggregate results for number condition. Here, when we aggregate everything, when we put everyone together, we see no difference, right? Here you see that there's no difference between the agreement and non-agreement trials. And you can see in the topograph that everything's kind of neutral. Now, from these results, you guys might think, okay, if we test Norwegians, you see an effect for gender, they process it, but number, maybe they're not processing it. But let's look further into these results. And now, what is the role of nativeness, or whether you're born and raised or not, right, in the Northern Norwegian dialect? Okay, so this is the figure for the ERP wave plot for gender conditions split by nativeness. So whether you are a native speaker of that dialect or non-native speaker. You can see the same pattern. You see a P600 effect, the same pattern for native and non-native speakers. All right, now let's look at the number condition. We see a totally different pattern. For the number, we see that native speakers of Northern Norwegian have a higher amplitude, you see here on the blue line, for agreement trials, which is ungrammatical in the Northern Norwegian dialect. However, when you look at the non-native speakers, you see that the non-agreement elicits higher amplitude because this is ungrammatical in the other dialects. So we see that the effect of nativeness matters for how these people process grammatical information. But we went further. We were like, okay, we know in bilingualism literature that nativeness matters, but also exposure matters. So how about we regress both nativeness and exposure? And what we find is that for gender, we see a little bit different pattern overall, but what we can see is that the non-agreement trials always elicits a higher amplitude than the agreement trials. So there's always this P6 effect, whether you're a native speaker or a non-native speaker. Okay, and this is the composite score. So this means the composite score or exposure measure doesn't matter. As long as whether you're native or non-native, it doesn't matter. You always elicit higher amplitude for non-agreement trials. Okay, but how about number? For number, we see a significant interaction between composite score, nativeness, and agreement, this three-way interaction. What you can see here is that for native speakers of Northern Norwegian, they always elicit a P600 effect, no matter what the exposure is for agreement trials. So that's the ungrammatical condition in Northern Norwegian. Now, what's interesting is the non-native speakers of Northern Norwegian. These people have a flipped effect depending on the exposure that you have to that dialect. So if you see here, the more exposure you have in Northern Norwegian, the agreement trial elicits higher than the non-agreement trial. So this is a P6 effect similar to the native people. Whereas once around this threshold here, you see a little bit of a flipped effect. So the less exposure you have in Northern Norwegian, maybe these people just moved to Tromsø and haven't had the time to build up exposure to this dialect. These people have higher amplitude for non-agreement than agreement, which is the expected pattern for the non-Northern Norwegians. Okay, so recap, I think the most interesting thing is for the behavioral versus brain results for the number condition. We see that in behavior results, when we tell them, say okay if this is something you hear in Norway, everyone says, regardless of agreement or non-agreement, that it's all good. They accept both cases of number agreement and non-agreement. However, when you actually look at the ERP results and regress it to their experience and nativeness, you see that actually native speakers have P600 for whatever the parsing grammar that they use in Northern Norwegian, and for the non-natives, that is modulated by exposure. So in summary, the processing of Northern Norwegian dialects seems to differ depending on exposure to or engagement with it. And one does not need to be a native speaker of Northern Norwegian to process its specific grammatical properties in a native-like manner. So exposure matters, right? Just as in bilingualism. And like L2 acquisition, bilectalism exists on a continuum whereby grammatical processing is modulated by an interaction of converging factors related to linguistic experience. But what we cannot answer in our study is what we're gonna do now with the follow-up work. What do these people do now when we're giving them in the other dialect mode or in the bookmal version? So this is just in Northern Norwegian. Now what do the Northern Norwegians do when they're given in the bookmal dialect? And this is the ongoing work that we're doing now. Can they adjust their processing strategies to the mode that they're not listening to, but reading, right? And we're doing currently a follow-up test on the participants in the study that showed a clear Northern Norwegian parsing pattern for number, and we're retesting them now in the bookmal mode with the same experimental design. And actually, I've already run a preliminary analysis that shows that these speakers are indeed bilectals. When processing the stimuli in bookmal now, the exact same stimuli written in the bookmal written mode, they show a bookmal parsing pattern. So now they show a P600 for number non-agreement instead of agreement. So yeah, this is all of what we have now, and thank you for your attention.
Time for questions. Okay, let's start from there, that side, please.
Hi, thank you, very interesting work. I'm Øystein at the University of Essex. If I'm not mistaken, on one of these slides, you were comparing natives and non-natives in terms of the impact of exposure. And on the left panel, you were focusing on gender. And again, if I've noticed correctly, so one of the slopes was negative going, and the other was almost positive, around zero. I wonder what your thoughts about that were, and if given the shape of the slopes, the difference in direction, how reliable that is.
Yeah, that's one thing that I'm not sure what to make of it, because yeah, obviously, but that's the aggregate and the patterns are the same, right? The differences between non-agreement and agreement, regardless of whether it's positive or negative slope, are the same. So it is puzzling that on the aggregate levels, the native speakers are like a positive slope, where the more exposure they have, the more positive the amplitude is. But the difference is the same across. So I'm not sure why the native speakers have the more exposure. Oh, sorry. The more exposure they have, it's more positive, and then for the non-native speakers, it's negative. But what I'm truly interested in is in the difference, because that's what the P6 effect is. So yeah, I can't answer that question because I truly don't know. But I think in answering our question, that's not a very important thing, but it is something that I'm puzzled by as well. So yeah, thanks for noticing. Yeah.
Thank you.
We stick to that side if you don't mind. So please go ahead.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for the interesting talk. I'm Isabel from the University of Edinburgh, and I kind of have, I would just like to hear your thoughts. So this was a reading study. I'm wondering if you were to run an auditory study, if you think your participants will be sensitive to the dialect that the speaker will be speaking. That is to say, if it's the people from Tromsø, if the speaker has an accent of the non-Tromsø region, then you will see that P600 or that sort of thing.
That's a good question. Yeah, because it could be that maybe the non-native speakers show even a stronger effect of exposure, because maybe these non-native speakers don't really see it in written form, the dialect, but maybe in spoken form, they listen to it more often, right? Because they're in Tromsø and they're immersed in that environment. So I would predict that if we did it in an auditory format, we would see more of this crossover effect for the non-native speakers. Maybe not for the native speakers, because the native speakers, it doesn't matter. As long as they're grown and raised in Tromsø, they show this effect. But I feel that for the auditory stimuli, maybe the effect will be larger for the non-native speakers.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, great talk.
Thank
I'm
you.
Susan Teuben-Rhodes from Auburn University. So, the overall behavioral data really showed no difference between the agreement and non-agreement conditions. But I'm wondering if you've related that to the brain data. Are the individuals who have kind of the reversed P600, are they showing different acceptance of the agreement and non-agreement?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we've also ran like a correlation study. We didn't really find any difference or correlation between the brain responses and the behavior responses. But I think that's because we asked this question in a way where if it's okay in all of Norway, then press yes. If we had asked that question, if this is only okay in the Northern Norwegian dialect, then I think the behavioral pattern would be different. So because we asked this in this way, we didn't really find any correlation, but I would imagine there would be a correlation if we asked the behavioral question, is this grammatical in the Northern Norwegian dialect? So I'm excited to see what would happen in the bookmal, because in bookmal, we did say, when we're running the ongoing study now, in bookmal, it's clear like what's grammatical and ungrammatical. So when we say in bookmal, if it's grammatical, say yes or no. So hopefully there will be a correlation in the ongoing study, but thank you very much for your suggestion.
Hi, Sola Goethe University. Thank you. I have more a clarification question about the conclusion slide at the end, where you were presenting it as a contrast between the behavioral data and the brain data. And I wonder if that's true, because it's actually you just did two different analyses, right? You could have grabbed the composite score of exposure and look at whether that modulates the acceptance rates. So my question would be, did you do that?
Yes, we did that, and it did not modulate. We did the accuracy of the behavior results and correlated or interacted that with exposure and nativeness, and none of that mattered. So the nativeness and exposure mattered only for the EEG results. Yeah, thanks. Thank you.
Hi, David, University of Geneva. Thank you for this fantastic talk, very thought-provoking actually. I have a very naive question, partly because I know nothing about Norwegian, partly because
Me too, so I don't know if I can answer that question, but yeah.
So my question is, you sort of started your talk by introducing the story of bilingualism and bilectalism.
Yeah.
My question is, especially seeing your data and how they would speak to this question, is how different are these two things? So how would you define what a dialect is, especially given your results?
I don't know, because in some dialects, there's not much syntactic differences, just maybe lexical or phonological, whereas in case of this landscape, there is this very much the syntactic difference as well. So it's an empirical question as to say what really defines a dialect from a language, but what I imagine, what I see here is that I'm sure that if somebody like, I don't know, a Dutch speaker came to Tromsø and learned the Tromsø dialect as their second language, I would expect that they would see exactly the same as someone from Oslo coming to Tromsø. So what we're trying to make here is that, the processing patterns and the factors that modulate this is not different from being a bilectal, even though they are mutually intelligible, from like some Dutch person coming to Norway. So I don't know if I've answered your question correctly, but I think that's an empirical question, and I'm not sure if our study can answer all of the questions that you have. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Time for a quick question.
Yeah, it's going to be very short. Nino Grillo, University of York. This is really a follow-up to the previous question on the auditory stimulating version. So you sort of answered to half of what I was expecting you to answer. So I wonder what do you expect would happen if you have non-Northern Norwegian accent with a kind of Northern Norwegian grammar for Northern Norwegian speakers?
Right, so you mean manipulating more the phonological aspect of the...
So have a non-Northern Norwegian speaker produce things in the Northern Norwegian grammar, how would Northern Norwegian speakers react to that? Because
Oh.
that would be unexpected.
That
right?
would be very weird, I think.
Yeah.
That would elicit probably a super high. Yeah, but I'm not sure. Yeah, I think that answers a totally, maybe not totally, but quite a different question from maybe what we're asking in terms of, because then that's like somebody, how do they react to like a non-native speaker speaking that your dialect, or right?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, so your question is primarily about how the different grammars that you can have drives your, and this is more about what kind of predictions you're going to make about what you're going to hear, what kind of grammar is going to be implemented by a particular speaker.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I would imagine the same, but yeah, maybe. I'm not sure in bilingual, I'm sure there's studies in bilingual literature that do that.
Not my domain.
Yeah, I'm not sure either.
I just wanted you to sort of finish answering the, all the scenarios.
That's definitely an interesting empirical question. And yeah, that could be another follow-up, but yeah, I have no clue. I wouldn't know what would
Thank you very much.
be. Yeah, but thank you.
We still have a request for a question from the chat.
Yes.
Please, you can unmute yourself, but a very quick question and answer, please. Thanks.
Is it me? So actually, it's I'm one of the authors. So this is Rothman.
Yes, sorry.
It's actually, I'd like to just expand on what Maki was saying to Nino's question and the question before. I think that it's a super interesting question, but I would like to advocate that this would be the wrong thing to do in our particular context. So one thing that Maki said from the outset was the flexibility of dialectal use in this context. And to go further, we should add that it would be extremely unnatural for somebody within Norway who would be heard as a native speaker of Norway to speak in a different dialect, right? So if we were to do what you guys are suggesting and have people, let's say from Oslo, which would have characteristics, of course, phonological characteristics spilling over, that would be so odd. That alone, with the methodology that we're using, I fear would clout any question that one could answer or even ask properly in that context. In a different environment, however, outside of Norway, where everybody uses their dialects, as Maki mentioned, even on the news, every person who's on the news is speaking their own dialect. Nobody speaks a standard. It would be arrogant, actually, in the Norwegian context to do so. But in a different context, of course, I think that that would matter. And there is plenty of work in L2 acquisition that shows that when you are confronted with non-native speech, the predictive reliability of particular cues might drop to such an extent that even native speakers turn off the use of prediction. So this has been done with gender. So, but then again, that's about prediction. So I think that it's a really cool question to ask, but maybe not the right environment to even try to do that here, because it would, the oddness of hearing somebody speaking Oslo trying to feign a Northern Norwegian dialect would be odd. So we have passive people, but we don't expect that these people we're testing use Northern Norwegian very much in the oral form. They would just be exposed to it and potentially engage in writing in it, at least in the default case. I hope that helps clarify.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and time is over for the break. Thanks all the speakers.